Well, once again, welcome everyone to today's kickoff webinar for a new series called Communicating Product Safety. We are so thrilled that all of you are with us today. I still see some folks joining us, but we are a few minutes past the hour, so we'll get started here. And to open the series this morning, I would like to turn the floor over to John Barrera, current president of the Society of Product Safety Professionals, who will share a few words with us before we get started. So with that, John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. My name is John Barrera, and welcome to the SPSP ADK webinar series, Communicating Product Safety. I'm the current president of the Society of Product Safety Professionals, and it's really exciting to see such an interest in the program from professionals like yourselves and from the companies that you represent. You know, it shows us we're moving in that right direction. And it's really feedback such as yours from the products and from the product safety community that helps SPSP and ADK design the webinars and educational programs we deliver. You know, we really strive to respond to the needs that we hear of from you in the community, especially where training and product safety courses are limited out there. That's what we're all about, is trying to fill that gap where there may not be this available training out there for the things we want to know about. SPSP serves the product safety community through education and training and maintaining an archive of product safety related materials such as technical papers and recorded webinars on the SPSP website. SPSP has been serving the product safety community since 2017. And now I'm so pleased to say we're partnering with ADK Information Services to provide even more opportunities to further that individual knowledge and expertise in the product safety field. Hence this new webinar series. You know, ADK has been designing and delivering university level product safety management education courses for the past 12 years, reaching over 1,000 professionals from manufacturers, retailers, importers, e-commerce platforms, just to name a few. SPSP and ADK have worked closely together for the past 5 years, and we've now formalized a partnership to continue our mission. It's a combination for success, I think, our success and your success. You know, we share the mission of providing better and better educational opportunities to the product safety community. With this partnership, SPSP and ADK are entering a new phase with a robust menu of high quality education courses and activities that will help product safety professionals get to the next level. You know, there's no question that you certainly have an all-star cast today and through this webinar series delivering this information. There's really no question about it. And I do refer to them as all-stars. You know, please ask questions and participate in the discussions of the topics. You know, audience participation is really an integral part of what we want from the series and the education. It truly adds to the learnings we all take away from the program. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa. And again, welcome and thank you for attending. And Lisa is the new SPSP Assistant Secretary and Board Member for SPSP. And as the moderator of the series, I'll turn it back to Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you for sharing that wonderful information on behalf of all of our attendees for today and for the series as a whole. You know, thank you to SPSP for taking this collaboration with ADK to the next level. It's so important that we all, as a product safety community of professionals, remain ahead of the curve when it comes to ongoing education, networking, and engagement in these very important topics that we'll be discussing here over the next week or so. So thanks again, John and SPSP. I'd also really like to thank Don Kornblatt of ADK Information Services. He has been our fearless leader in this educational endeavor. And certainly this is only one of many opportunities that ADK and SPSP are putting together. So I would encourage all of you to make sure that you are on the email list for SPSP and ADK. At the bottom of their regular email series is a new feature called the registration desk. And in this virtual world that we still find ourselves living in, that is a really great way to stay on top of the opportunities that are available to all of us and to click and read and register for the things that you're interested in. So please be on the lookout for that and certainly reach out by chat today or by email to John, Don, or myself if you need help finding any of that information. So with that, I'd like to just also share that we are up to about 200 individuals registered for today's session. And those folks are coming from not just the United States, but other countries as well. So the word is getting out there about this terrific educational opportunity, and registration is still open. This is the first of 7. So if you would like to invite your colleagues to join you on the remaining sessions, please feel free to do so. One of the other wonderful opportunities that we have as participants in this series is the opportunity to earn a certificate of completion. So participation in all 7 webinars and then an essay at the end with a small processing fee will entitle anyone who chooses to take advantage to that certificate of completion. So we'll be sending information out about that opportunity at the conclusion of the entire series. So be on the lookout for that. And certainly it's a great thing to add to your LinkedIn profile and all of those other ways that you can tout your professional achievements. So moving forward in the vein of thank yous, I would also like to acknowledge a new friend to this process, Loden Harp. She has been supporting SP, SP, and ADK in a number of different ways, but she is the wizard behind the curtain when it comes to logistics and technology for this webinar series. So thank you to Loden for support in that way. And now again, the goal of this webinar series certainly is to give all of us, the product safety professional community, extra tools in your communications resource toolkit that can help you become more effective in building understanding and support for the product safety mission that you're all serving in your individual companies or organizations. So let's keep that in mind as we work through today's content. I am very pleased to be sharing the screen with Michael Del Negro. Certainly many of you know him well, have heard him speak before. Michael is very recently transitioned into the role of Vice President, Product Safety and Compliance for Peloton Interactive. And so to kick off this first webinar of this series of 7, Michael will be talking about how to communicate with senior management and C-suite executives, again, in the hopes of helping us all become more effective in the ways that we do that. So I would welcome Michael to the screen. I know he has some slides to share with us as well. And as John mentioned, please, everyone who's participating today, use the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen to share your questions as Michael's talking. We'll try to make this as much of a dialogue as possible, and your questions are really important in helping us do that. So please enter your questions. And with that, Michael, take it away.
Great, Lisa, thank you. And just one housekeeping item, I should share the slides on my end, is that right?
That's correct, yes. Okay,
great, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I hope you all can hear me pretty well, reasonably well. If not, Lisa or others will let me know. So I'll put my slides on the page in a second. I just want to take a minute to say I'm delighted to be here. This kind of work is much better done in live session with people. Some of us may be craving that. Some of us may enjoy the Zoom screen. I, for one, am sort of ready to get back to normal interactions in these settings, but I am grateful for the opportunity from SPSP and from ADK Information Services and Don. And I've worked with Lisa before, so it's a pleasure to be back in this format with Lisa's help, able help as a moderator. But I'm appreciative. And you know, the 7-part series is really packed. I think people, if you look at the agendas, there's a lot of really good content. I'm going to try and touch on some themes today that I hope people will take away from my remarks. And I have 3 children, and they don't always listen to me, but hopefully some of you will take away some of the lessons learned, you know, from my perspective on sort of safety best practices, working inside, and think about these themes as you hear from others like Eric Rubel and other presenters as they talk about different aspects of communicating with the government or with other parties, and what that looks like. So I think it's really important to kind of know where a person comes from in terms of their professional background and what informs their thinking on these things. So I'll just say briefly, and Lisa touched on this, but I've spent 11 years working in the consumer product manufacturing world. 5.5 of those years was General Electric with their appliance business and lighting, and then 5.5 years with G Appliances, a hire company, also in the appliance business. I've been a lawyer 20 years, but going back to the earlier phase of my life, I also had graduate education in psychology, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time today, without totally going off, into a tangent, talking a little bit about the way that how we think about communications in the corporate setting, some of the natural cognitive errors that can creep into decision making can affect how we communicate with leaders, and then can in turn affect their decision making. So just bear with me. Some of this is to reassure my mom that my graduate school tuition was not wasted. And then the last thing I'll say by way of preamble is I'm going to say a few things today about engineers. I just want to say I have great engineer envy. My strong belief is that lawyers and compliance professionals and engineers can work together in almost near perfect harmony. And what I would say is, the technical teams that do the risk monitoring and evaluation work and help organizations identify technical risks and mitigate them, they're really at the heart of a lot of this work. And that the synergy comes, as you'll see, as we get into some of my comments later, in ways that engineers can work constructively with other disciplines. So we'll talk about that too. Okay, enough throat clearing. Let me share some slides here. Lisa, is this coming up okay?
I can see your notes slides as well, so you may want to change the presentation view, but.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. There, better?
I'm still seeing the notes, but the main slide is there, so you certainly see this way.
Well, we can, that's all right. We'll leave it as is. Okay. Just give everyone a notion of the roadmap for today. Where we're headed, where hopefully we wind up at the end of the conversation. And Lisa's going to do her best to interrupt me and stop me from myself as we go too far down the road. We'll talk a little about communication goals, make it clear what's expected of a company when managing internal communications. Talk about some do's and don'ts, or what I like to call best practices, good communication hygiene. We'll talk about the role of uncertainty in managing internal safety escalations and safety issues. And I'll say a little bit about how the regulators expect companies to think about uncertainty. I won't go far into that because other panels will cover that, but we'll touch on that. And then finally, I want to spend a few minutes on the role of companies' culture, safety culture in particular, in how we think about optimal ways to structure communications. What's the purpose of the communication, and what are some of the best practices that companies can have as they move forward. So I've sort of set this up here in a flow, and I could have numbered these. I chose not to, but this is an information wheel. And I think of this as an investigation process or a safety review process. And it begins with what scientists would call, data collection. So companies are tasked with and have systems set up to collect lots and lots of information to engage in data collection, which is really step one. So obtain and provide information. And this is really like the basic level of managing internal communication. So step one is, there's data that flows into companies from multiple different inputs, and companies are expected to kind of collate and look at this information to gather it. My view here is companies really ought to be omnivores with respect to data. And certainly the regulatory guidance that is out there is a company should look at inputs from all different types of sources. And omnivores in the sense of relying on, consumer complaints and warranty information, product liability lawsuits, but there's a host of inputs into a company, and the more information that can be collected, to a point, the better. This wheel is, again, a wheel, so it's driving ultimately an action that we'll talk about. But the goal of the data collection is not just simply, to be an archivist. It's not to create a library of incident information. It is to improve our understanding of technical risk, of a particular risk. So as we move to the top of the wheel to improve understanding, that's really looking at the data that's been culled from what I would consider like a trend database. So companies have systems to collate and collect information, but then to look at it from the standpoint of, are they seeing trends with the understanding that we're expected to come up with what we see as patterns that begin to coalesce with respect to safety and field safety. And then third is going from just improving our understanding to thinking about persuading senior executives. So now you have done some data collection, you've begun to improve your understanding of, say, what looks like a pattern or trend. How do you then transition from that to thinking about talking with executives? And this, by the way, doesn't have to be a safety investigation wheel. This could be any self-improvement activity that a company engages in the safety realm. So I'll keep all my comments focused on safety. And ultimately moving from persuasion to action. So obviously the point of a, internal communication is to drive a business decision, to help senior management make a decision in the context of, adversity or, uncertainty. And we all have to remember that, business leaders are tasked with making sometimes a small number of very impactful business decisions over the course of a year. In many different domains, and safety is obviously a critically important one. And often they're asked to do this in reliance on teams across the enterprise without a full picture. So there's some uncertainty that creeps into that. But nonetheless, this is sort of the next hub on the wheel from persuading people in management that there's a particular concern to moving to driving action. And then the reason I've had change behavior on here is, an action is a particular decision at a point in time that the company takes. Change in behavior is changing over time the way the company thinks about these processes and thinks about safety. And that's a more ingrained aspect of sort of this information wheel. So my communication initially could be, I see a concern, we've collected some data, we've identified the concern, we've improved our understanding. That might be where we do internally some hazard identification. We then begin to talk to business leaders that help manage technical risk to persuade them of a point of view with the goal of driving an action. And then that process over time, as it gets ingrained in the business, is really part of the business's culture in terms of how they manage safety. So just to put some meat on the bones here, so that's just the outline. Ultimately the goal here, as I see it, from my perspective, is to encourage proactive communication about potential risks. And the word potential there is because sometimes we don't know exactly what the risk is. It could be minor, it could be potentially something more concerning. We want to expand, and I'll touch on this later, Lisa, when I come back to the culture piece of this discussion, and think about ways to expand communication across silos. No one is a perfect communicator, and all of us who live with life partners get this feedback on a regular basis. So this is a common aspect of humans, is we frequently engage in communication in ways that we don't intend, where the message delivered is not what we intended to deliver. And so we just have to be sensitive to this. One of the ways we can work on that is by communicating better across silos, and that includes disciplines and functions within an organization. I feel very passionately about this. I'll talk a little bit more about this. And also remember, as we do this, that feedback is a gift, something I remind myself about that when I get feedback from friends and family. Avoid critical information gaps. Evaluating safety often involves pieces of a puzzle. And many of these things, as you've heard others speak about, are looked at in hindsight. And hindsight is, of course, always 20/20. So we have to be able to be sensitive to where do we have a gap in our understanding that fundamentally might change how we're looking at the risk. And we'll talk about some examples of that in a little bit. To me, a critical part of internal communications around this area, again, around this investigation wheel, let's call it, is being able to document internally and appropriately the company's assessment of a risk at a given point in time. This is an area where many companies struggle because there's competition internally, or not competition, there's disagreement perhaps on how much should we write down, should we cloak it in attorney-client privilege. But for me, as I think through these things, I think it's really critically important as companies move along and the years are hectic to be able to point back to a point in time and say, this was our thinking at time one, why we did or didn't take a particular action, and be able to have some internal communication appropriately prepared that shows what the company's evaluation was at that point in time. This is an area where everyone needs to improve. This is like a hygiene area where I just think there's lots and lots of room for improvement. And finally, the ultimate goal of this information wheel really, as I said, is to drive business decisions in the face of uncertainty and adversity. And this is, this is true for safety organizations at all levels, whether we're talking about consumer products or automotive. It cuts across domains. But this basic wheel of sort of influencing executive decision-making is a process that plays out over and over again. So I'll pause there, Lisa, in case you have any questions or comments.
That's a terrific overview and setting the stage for a lot of the detail that I know you're going to be diving into over the next few slides and 20, 30 minutes or so. But one question maybe that you might be getting to, but if not, now's a good time to ask it. When we're thinking about expanding communication across those silos and really buckling down to do that documentation you talked about, we're looking at a varied group of individuals representing different perspectives and interests around the table, right? Your legal team, your compliance team, et cetera. So how do you speak one language that everyone can understand and synthesize and really get everyone on the same page when you're thinking about those silos?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think what I would say is, I don't think that everyone has to speak the same language. And I think that engineers and legal and compliance professionals don't necessarily speak the same language in the sense of how they look at risk and risk information. And I don't say that in a negative way. I think the disciplines approach these issues very differently in how we look at these things. And that's a good thing. And so what I would say is, the cross-functional piece of this, a theme that I'll touch on again, is we sort of have to accept each other for our disciplines, flaws, and habits and things like that, and understand that engineers have a tendency to, since there's no engineers in the panel, I can say this freely and others can give feedback, but engineers have a tendency often to see things from the inside out, to go to the detail first. Lawyers and compliance folks sometimes start with high level details and then get more specific. It's just inherent in the training in these disciplines. Neither approach is wrong or right, and each has value. So what I would say is we want to be speaking in the same framework, hand in hand, as we march along in these processes to figure out what's an appropriate decision to be taken or recommended. And I think that leaders want to hear from technical experts, and they also want to hear from compliance and legal experts. And I think that combination of voices ultimately, when there's good coordination, doesn't have to be harmony. That's why I say near perfect harmony, but as long as there's good coordination, the ultimate message and sort of recommendation to senior management is I think a good one.
That's terrific. And you used the word synergy early in your remarks. And I think that's a great frame of reference to keep in mind as we think about these things, that creating synergies really helps at the end of the end of the road and coming to a decision or something of that nature. So excellent. Let's move on.
Okay. All right. So this is my nod to the matrix. I wanted to just touch on this because as companies review safety inputs, they are looking at lots and lots of data, and it can be dizzying how much information can flow into a company from multiple sources. There was once upon a time a simpler time, but in the digital age, we're living at a time when the flow of information is from numerous sources. And so, good hygiene applies not only with your dental care routine, but to how companies structure their communication practices internally. And these are just some guidance that I picked up in my experience, some from government investigations, some from having worked in-house for a long time. I'm not a communications professional, so I defer to those experts on internal corporate communications. But these are, when we're talking about safety and risk internally, what are some of the best practices and what are some things to be mindful of? I do think internal communications that are clear, concise, and objective are important. And I say that knowing that there is a point of view that says, well, that language itself, even telling employees to write clear, concise, and objectively, is seen by some as sort of, you're trying to minimize what people might write. That's really not the goal. The goal is what I like to call a sort of newspaper reporter's view of the world, or what newspaper reporting in some views used to be, which is just the facts, ma'am or sir, sort of the black and white letter of here's what we know, and also flagging what we don't know. One of the things that's hard as humans is to admit when we don't know something. And I see this over and over again in business meetings where we want to be confident for good reasons. We want to show that we know what we know, and it's very hard to flag gaps in our knowledge. But in being objective about writing things, it's important to flag what we don't know and what I call levels of evidence. So oftentimes the initial safety report that comes into a company is a pretty weak signal. It's not a company with objective information. It's not something that is very clear. And I don't think it should be discarded. At the same time, if the level of evidence is not as strong as it could be, that's information that the safety committee or the team needs to be aware of. So just the facts, ma'am. I think this is important. At the same time, there's a flip side of that, which is, companies ought to encourage raising concerns in training materials and beware of tempering. This is something that lawyers are, by training, who are here with well intentions to defend the enterprise and to take appropriate positions internally in managing this risk. But in some of the high profile safety investigations, training materials that encouraged employees to use euphemisms, for example, or to avoid adjectives that could be seen as negative or an admission of fault on behalf of the company. That guidance has been widely criticized, and I'll talk later about the General Motors ignition switch recall. This is an older case study, widely studied for many aspects. We'll talk about the communication and coordination piece of it. But the company had prepared internal training materials that encourage employees to not use the word defect, to use euphemisms. I actually think that the use of a euphemism in some ways calls more attention to an issue than saying directly what the business is seeing. In the lighting industry, this is well known, but for many years, there was a phrase called a non-passive failure. A non-passive failure is a light bulb that breaks. And just the awkwardness of that phrase made it, I think, kind of more problematic than just saying what had occurred. In the GM ignition switch recall, which went on to be a congressional inquiry with disclosure of a lengthy and very good detailed report, one of the things that was pointed to was the way the company spoke to employees about how to raise concerns and what was appropriate. This gets at the company's culture. Are we allowed to speak up? Are we allowed to document these concerns? I still believe they have to be done objectively. I think that's important. I think it's also important to, help train employees on not speculating and not editorializing in things, but just the facts. That is part of promoting appropriate safety communications at all levels of the enterprise, and that means making sure we're showing a commitment to the importance of safety when we're describing incidents and data, doing that appropriately, not minimizing safety concerns, not disregarding concern, and at the same time, however, flagging when there's gaps in what we know and encouraging actions or investigation steps that need to be taken. That is also appropriate when the information is at a level of uncertainty or evidence that's kind of weak. And finally, ultimately, as we've been talking about, going back to that investigation wheel, that hub, communications should identify risks and appropriate actions to address risks. And ultimately, senior management wants recommendations from teams on what are the risks, what are the options for addressing those risks, and what are the consequences of option A, B, or C. And all this activity of collating information, going back to that information wheel, leading up to a business recommendation, is about identifying risks and options for management to take an appropriate step to manage risk. And again, the goal in this flow matrix data that comes into businesses is to look for a signal through the noise, and to do that with reasonable precision and in ways that's compliant with regulatory guidelines for notifying authorities and communicating with management about that activity. So this is actually a very complex process. It's sometimes described as simple because that's, again, the hindsight bias, but it's more complicated than I think people realize. And Lisa, I'm just going to make sure I'm in slideshow mode. There we go. Is that coming through?
We have yes, it's perfect. And we have a great question that just came through from the floor on this slide. And that is whether you can share your perspective on having a cross-functional safety committee to kind of synthesize all of the initial information coming through and whatever issues might be identified. before communicating with the upper management?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, shows a lot of wisdom in thinking about safety. I think that, it's both my view and I think the view of many regulators and other professionals who work in the product safety field is that, these are risk areas that benefit from cross-functional and collaborative work. There are different ways to do that with clear ownership for, as I said, technical risk leaders who are the heart of a lot of this work. But I think the benefits of that are just like in healthcare. When you have a cross-functional team, you get better health outcomes, and the same is true in safety outcomes. So, they're different, but the healthcare model is we want good structure, good process, good healthcare outcomes. If you don't have good structure, good process, you can't have good outcomes. And that's I believe, very true in the safety world as well. So an optimal structure with puts and takes, checks and balances that could be seen as a collaborative process externally. So by others who might look at the company's process that's structured in a way that has different voices on it, and different voices that bring different perspectives. That's a much more effective process over time in achieving good outcomes. We can't always have good outcomes, just like a hospital can't always have a good outcome. There are recalls happen. That's part of manufacturing products and learning from product experiences over time. That's a natural progression of human experience. I don't view recalls fundamentally as a bad thing, but the team question, I think, is really, at least for me in my experience, is very important.
Absolutely. And so in your experience, another great question from an industry veteran participating today is, what's the best way to get senior leaders or the C-suite to understand the very real complexity of these safety and compliance issues with a mind toward building that culture without first having to live through a crisis? How do we do it before we experience the negativity of a crisis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there are some who believe that companies only learn when they go through a crisis. I don't think that's necessarily true. Certainly living through a difficult period can spur change. That itself is a positive thing. But positive safety organizations adapt to change. They adapt to external developments, and they do that in lots of different ways. I think that companies can choose to benchmark safety. Many companies don't view product safety as a competitive area, and a best practice for sure is learning how other companies structure their safety program, learning from that, not necessarily imitating it, because the governance model for these risk areas has to work within the culture and mindset of your company. And if it doesn't fit, it won't work. So it's got to be both a kind of a ground up and a top down process. But I think there are many ways to do things like use the case studies. The GM ignition switch recall, I think, is just really a good one because it's so public. I mean, the 300-page, summary of findings and recommendations is a very lengthy review of some of the structure process issues that I'm talking about today. And I think those are useful to say, hey, look, there's real incentives here. And finally, the last thing I would say, Lisa, is consumers care a lot about safety, and they care about companies that can index on safety. And so that's increasingly an attribute that matters. We don't talk a lot about that in the consumer product world. In automotive, we're kind of used to tiers of safety, and that's a little bit gets more discussion in that industry, that sector. But I think for consumers who are increasingly thinking about these things, this is just an important area, and companies can show, don't tell, but show how their commitment is in this area.
I think you made a great point, Michael, in that there's a significant number of studies that have been done over the years that we as product safety professionals can look at to get our minds around how to frame this within our own organizations. And certainly every industry is very different, but looking at those across the spectrum is a great way to synthesize that information a bit as well. So great questions from the audience. Keep them coming. And Michael, we'll move on.
Okay, let's move on. And then just as we transition, I'll mention these issues of working in teams is really about teaming. And together, companies can go very far if they're effectively teaming on these things. And that requires a lot of puts and takes across the enterprise. But that teaming is really the essence of a lot of this work. Okay, let's transition to something that's near and dear to my heart, which is social ecology and the way that our approach to thinking influences decision making and some of the errors that can creep into this. And I offer this in a non-judgmental way to say that all humans have various biases that we engage in. They're often referred to as heuristics or shortcuts that we take, not necessarily a bad thing, but when those thinking patterns are applied in decision-making models around safety, they can have consequences. This is a well-known one. I like this, the quote, human beings aren't rational animals. We are human animals who want to appear rational to ourselves. And that just highlights the fact that, we're constantly thinking about ways to balance our attitudes and avoid discrepancies between attitudes or between our attitudes and our actions, okay? And when we have those discrepancies, it's mentally uncomfortable. It creates what psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance. And that is motivating. It's a motivating state to reduce the dissonance, and there are different ways to do that. I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples here, but this is a brief detour. We'll get back to how this impacts corporate decision-making and communication, but I think these, at its base level, understanding how these biases creep into decision-making is really important. The well-known one from the Challenger, the Space Shuttle Challenger example, and for those of us old enough to remember that, this was a January 1986 launch of the space shuttle back when, we used to watch the launch in school. And I remember being in school and, watching these launches as they occurred. It was a particularly cold morning, and 73 seconds after liftoff, the vehicle exploded into fragments, and the crew were lost. This went on to be studied famously by a commission and Richard Feynman and many others who evaluated the particular cause, but there was a human dynamic element of this that came out in studies and has since been talked about in great detail. The particular specific root cause, of course, was an O-ring that sealed the solid rocket boosters that on this very cold morning had shrunk and allowed vapors to expand and escape, and ultimately led to the explosion. But it came out in the subsequent investigation by the commission that engineers had flagged this risk of a cold weather launch, that had had some internal communications about it, and that those concerns kind of bumped into, call it management thinking around the desire to launch. So groupthink historically is a phenomenon that occurs in groups of people where, dissenting views of the group are sort of discounted or ignored. This often happens in settings where you don't have a terribly diverse panel of inputs, or where there's an overriding management desire to go down a particular path and you discount information. There was a lot of media associated with the launch. I think it was the first teacher in space, maybe the first female astronaut in space. There was a lot of hype around getting the vehicle launched, and concerns raised by the engineers, which were documented about cold weather launches and the state of these O-rings was ignored. I offer this not because I think this happens in lots and lots of organizations, but it's a tendency that can occur when there's poor communication between technical teams who are aware of risk and other decision makers in the organization. I'll flag one other comment here, which is for those of you who've studied these product safety lessons over the years. There's a field called human operational performance, which is looking at the ways that we have unplanned deviations from outcomes that are desired, and what are the specific causes of those, and what are the latent risks in a safety system that get triggered that lead to the outcome. And in the case of the Challenger example, it was a lack of voice for the technical teams to really get through to management, to have sort of a cross-functional look at and be heard when they raise these concerns. Confirmation bias is a tendency to search essentially for self-fulfilling information. We have a belief, we're really confident that that belief is true, and we tend to collect, interpret, and then recall information that is consistent with our existing hypothesis. We're not looking for contrary information. It's essentially kind of reinforcement-seeking behavior. And in the safety decision-making process, this is one of the areas where companies have to stop and say, all right, so far we're seeing a trend. We think it's benign, but let's look for information that discounts or points to a different position potentially. And again, these behaviors, these traits arrive. And the last one is availability heuristic, which for those of you in the pandemic who started reading the news are familiar with this one, which is you read a news story about the pandemic and you start to realize, oh, this could be me, or this is happening. And this is how frequently or readily we can recall information. It lets us to make estimates of how available it is, how likely it is to occur, even if it's very remote. But we recall it very easily, so it seems like it's very likely to occur. This is a heuristic, well-known, and thanks to the media and pandemic journalism, we're all scientists in one way or another. These are interesting and all that, but what do we do with them? So let's just talk for a minute about an organization can acknowledge these risks exist and how groups think through things. How do we deal with them? And what are some of the suggestions? I have three. One is, companies can, intentionally expose your thinking and assessment to contrary views. A cross-functional team helps do that. You get different voices in a group, a leadership group, that so long as people are comfortable having discussion, right, and tolerating difference of views, you can challenge some of the groupthink dynamics. And that's very important, being able to speak up, being able to be heard in the organization and raise a dissenting view. That can get to a point where you have to say, okay, we need to take a business decision. So you have to be balanced and say, we've heard the dissenting views, now we're taking a business decision. That's a very important type of closure I think businesses have to be good at. So this can't go on ad infinitum. Structuring your safety team with diverse professionals, ensuring it's cross-functional, is one of the ways that you avoid the kind of groupthink dynamics, because you've got different disciplines represented there. And then the third one that I think is the most critical is safety happens over time, right? And what a company may evaluate at a given point in time, you have to come back to when there's new or different information. And so revisiting an old assessment in light of new information is a very an important attribute for a healthy safety organization. It's good hygiene, good practice to say, okay, I know last year we felt this way, but this new development has occurred. What do we do with this? This is different information than we previously believed. How do we handle it? And effective and productive safety organizations are able to revisit the prior assessments and make new decisions in light of that information. And I think, again, no collection of individuals making human decisions is perfect. We know that. Everybody understands that. But these are just some of the tools that we can hopefully use to think about challenging ourselves, to think differently about risk, making sure that our beliefs are really tested and that they're sort of have a sound footing. And if we're not sure, all of us who work in businesses or government or any other roles, we all want to be sure of our views. It's, confidence is very prized in these organizations and decision-making models, but it never hurts to be a little skeptical as well. And I just think that helps us get to better decisions when we're skeptical, in a productive way. So let me just pause there. This is my best looking slide. So if you have any questions, Lisa, let me know.
Well, it's a beautiful slide. And I love this dive into a little bit of the academic, because while we're here to talk about communications and communicating effectively across the spectrum of our organizations, I think one of the keys to effective communication is self-awareness, right? And so if we learn these types of things, we can work toward being aware of defeating confirmation bias, for example, or if we are really working to create a culture within our organizations about safety and having effective communications and putting the right people around the table and actively and openly listening to those perspectives, we really can avoid some of these pitfalls that you're talking about. So I think this was a great dive into something that we don't often think about, but probably should.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so let's transition to dealing with uncertainty. As again, on that information wheel we talked about at the very beginning, and I'm going to bring this to a more practical level now. So we'll move out of the academic stuff and get into the more how do businesses actually do this stuff. What are some of the best practices? But we all want to remember that safety systems are designed to operate with a bias for action. So we want to be able to do that in the face of adversity and uncertainty. And so, just a few things about this area, which I think is really critical to understand. Organizations deal with uncertainty. It's inherent in reviewing potential safety concerns. As I mentioned earlier, in the flow of information that comes in, there's often minimal information, or it's not accompanied by something objective, and it's very hard for companies to get more information. There are reasons for that structurally sometimes. And so in light of that sort of uncertainty, you have to acknowledge that it exists. And I think that's hard when you're in a decision-making mode and the company wants to take a decision. Communicating about uncertainty is a key feature of the company's safety compliance program. And I say that because you have to be able to flag for senior management, again, what do we know? What do we not know? And what are the consequences of not knowing a particular issue with respect to risk? And for me, and I won't go deep into this because I think your other panels, Lisa, will get into these domains, but all modern safety regulatory frameworks require firms to address uncertainty when they evaluate potential risks. It's either in the reporting guidance, or it's in a risk assessment guidance, or it's just sort of a good principle that's been talked about in those regimes. In the US, subject firms are urged to report when in doubt. This is from the CPSC's Substantial Product Hazard Rule. In Canada, Health Canada's risk assessment guidance talks about an assessment must identify uncertainties and deal with them. And in the EU, take into account uncertainty in harm scenarios, or what's frequently known as the precautionary principle. So in the face of a potential risk, companies are expected and encouraged to make decisions in light of those uncertainties. And I like to think of uncertainty sometimes as, strength of knowledge. How much do we really know what we know? What's the foundation for that? Do we need to know more? A few suggestions on this. One is, companies are allowed to investigate and allowed to try to understand what risk is. That is not an unlimited opportunity or option. Companies at some point have to make decisions, even when they don't necessarily fully understand the risk. And this is a challenge for many organizations. In some industries, risk is kind of binary, meaning, and even in the aviation world, they have risk levels that are very well defined objectively, so that if airline experiences something, it's like in a different category. It's very clearly defined by the regulator and understood by the regulated parties. In the consumer product world, there's certainly clear guidance, but there are areas that are gray, and companies have to deal with the gray. The color of the slide here, the background is just coincidence, but you have to learn how to deal with uncertainties in your safety committee or your safety governance process and take appropriate measures in light of those uncertainties. So let me just pause there and see if there are any questions about that. I think this is, to me, this is one of the more challenging parts of managing safety. Is if everything was clear, if safety were binary, a 0 or 1, we would know what to do. But when it's in the gray, that's where I think decision-making becomes more complex.
And no questions coming from the floor at the moment, but certainly encourage folks to keep thinking through as we're going here.
So there's no uncertainty among the participants. That's really good. All right, there we go. All right, so we talked about the last foundation of a strong safety process, and that which is culture. And this is something that I think gets a lot of discussion, but maybe is not really well understood. To me, culture and a strong safety culture is tangible. It's measurable. It can be looked at and evaluated in lots of different objective ways. It has some subjective elements, but it's really fundamentally important. It signals the company's tone at the top and commitment, and it signals, the willingness of employees to take part in the safety culture, to communicate in it, and it's increasingly cited as a critical attribute for companies that have a robust safety program. So government investigations speak a lot about the importance of a culture of safety. In particular, what does that mean? Company culture is increasingly cited in government safety investigations as a key ingredient. In the General Motors ignition switch recall, as an example, there were phrases like the GM nod. There were descriptions of the way company management did or didn't want employees to raise particular safety concerns. These weren't necessarily well documented, but many employees reported this in the subsequent investigation. And those kind of statements, which again go back to things like tempering communications, where employees are encouraged to use euphemisms or not write down the bad thing, that's evidence of, sort of the company's culture around safety. Do employees have the ability to speak up and raise potential safety concerns? Open reporting was a very big aspect of GE's, culture of integrity, and they were very well known, as are many other companies, for having a commitment and expectation that employees would come forward when they saw concerns of any, code of conduct or potential integrity concern, but particularly around safety. And that understanding that, hey, management expects us to raise these concerns in good faith and timely is a reasonable and important expectation, and one that I think is a key attribute of a healthy safety culture. We touched on documentation best practices. This too gets at safety, the culture. Are employees encouraged to write things down in ways that are productive? Are they shushed? Just the way we sometimes shush people for saying things. And again, this is a balance. I'm not suggesting that companies have to over document. There are perils of doing that as well. But this is a balance between encouraging people to come up and raise concerns and have those heard over time. And that gets at this process for escalating concerns. Is there a defined process for escalating a potential safety concern that comes in? Is there some familiarity with where to go? This is just, in large companies in particular, something that just needs constant training. This is not that easy. In a smaller company, it might be simpler, but in large matrix organizations, just reinforcing what the process is for escalating concerns gets at the heart of what we've been talking about, which is defined roles, responsibilities. If you have a safety governance model, people know that information goes to the safety team. And to the extent that team has visibility, that's a really positive thing. And some companies get to a point ultimately where they're talking about their safety team and their commitment to safety in that space. And I think that fundamentally is really good. And then we've already kind of touched on this. I won't index any further on it. But again, communicating across silos, I'm a big believer in, partly because my professional life has spanned different disciplines. I think this is, one of the key ingredients to having a really strong team. And again, respecting the disciplines and not expecting everyone to, I think you said, speak the same language. I certainly think you want to have the same goal and, purpose for the program, but it's okay if engineers have their language and compliance and legal professionals have theirs, so long as we're moving along the same path.
Wonderful. Let's do a couple of rapid fire questions as we wrap up our time together. And so, we talked a lot about the different perspectives within a company that are sitting around the table having these conversations and creating the culture. But how do you feel about engaging outside experts from, external to the company or to those core teams to deal with some of these potential issues or concerns about uncertainty?
Yeah, look, I think that it's a great question. I think that companies can improve in lots of different ways, and organizations that have a good safety culture are constantly learning. And one of the ways to learn really effectively is to bring in stakeholders, experts who do this stuff for a living, and you can really up the company's game by relying on the right set of experts, at the right time in a critical investigation and getting input. I like to do that in partnership with experts and not just sort of say, okay, this is your thing, you go figure it out, but do that as a partnership. And speaking of synergy, that's really where the outside person's expertise, when you're working really closely and collaboratively with in-house folks, that's where the maximum benefit is, because the in-house folks are part of the culture, that they understand how to operationalize the advice. And so long as that bridge is a good one, I think it's incredibly beneficial. And we have to remember that when we deal with regulators, that sometimes having a third party adds credibility to positions that a company might want to take. There are really good reasons for doing that. And I think that's, we're smart to remember that in lots of different domains.
Absolutely. And if we think back to the previous slide that outlined the gray areas that we need to be thinking about, do you have any resources or references that you could point to help process those types of uncertainties?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, certainly I highlighted the three regimes that I think speak to this issue of regulatory guidance around dealing with uncertainty, just because I think that's where regulated parties should be looking, companies should be looking as an initial point. But there's lots of guidance out there on, in the face of uncertainty, at understanding different aspects of the investigation wheel, how to proceed, what's the best practice for improving our understanding of, say, technical risk. But my suggestion really for teams is look to that guidance, evaluate it, see how it can make sense in your business, and operationalize it in ways that you can show that you've applied it in good faith. I think that and there's lots of other layers of expertise that are out there beyond the regulatory guidance from law firms and consultants. And that's all stuff that you should just sort of consume. Again, being an omnivore for this information is really important. And that's how companies grow.
I love that, being an omnivore. That's the way to go. And a great takeaway to end our session here today. We are at time. Thank you, Michael, for this incredible information. It was very helpful and a terrific, again, level set for what this series is intended to do for the product safety community. So we again are talking about communication over the next few weeks here, and in all different sorts of ways and venues. So again, thank you to Michael. We certainly appreciate your time and sharing your expertise. And certainly SPSP and ADK Information Services, thank you all again. Please be on the lookout for a quick survey that you may receive in your email, just to answer a couple of quick questions. I promise it's short. And join us again tomorrow, same time, same place. We'll be here again to take the next step in our communication journey. So look forward to seeing you all then, and take care until. Have a great day.
Thank you, Lisa.